The night Evelyn Cross walked into the Hartwell Grand Ballroom, she had no idea she was about to meet the only person in the room who wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. 300 guests, champagne at $200 a glass, and a billionaire who thought money gave him the right to say anything to anyone. When he turned on her in front of every camera and every carefully dressed investor in that room, nobody moved, nobody said a word, except the man in the maintenance uniform standing near the back wall. If this story moves you, drop a like and tell me the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The Hartwell Grand Hotel had a way of making people feel smaller than they were. It wasn't the ceilings, though they were high enough that the chandelier above the main ballroom looked like a small galaxy suspended in amber light. It wasn't the staff, who moved with the kind of trained invisibility that money purchased at a premium. It was something in the air itself, a pressure, faint but constant, that reminded every person who walked through those brass doors that they were being evaluated, that their clothes, their posture, the name they dropped into the first 30 seconds of conversation mattered in ways that had nothing to do with the charity on the printed programs. Evelyn Cross felt it the moment she stepped off the elevator. She paused just inside the entrance to the ballroom, champagne flute in hand, watching the room arrange itself the way rooms like this always did, by net worth, by proximity to net worth, and by the performance of not caring about net worth. She was 30 years old. She had run Viridian Capital for 4 years, since her predecessor had a stroke in this very hotel. Actually, 2 floors up, at a dinner she had not attended. She had grown the firm by 38% in a market that had been unkind to everyone. She had done it by working longer hours than she slept, by making calls she wasn't sure would work, by admitting, privately, to her assistant Diane and no one else, that she was scared most of the time. None of that showed. What showed was the dark green dress, the quiet authority in her posture, and the expression she had practiced until it felt almost real, calm, approachable, mildly interested. It was armor. She had learned early that a woman who looked uncertain in rooms like this one was a woman who left with fewer options than she arrived with. Evelyn, a hand on her arm, soft. She turned to find Helen Marsh, the foundation's director, silver-haired and bright-eyed, the kind of woman who genuinely loved events like this one. "You made it." "I did." Evelyn let herself be embraced briefly. "The children's wing update looks good. I saw the photos in the program." "We're almost at the funding target. Another 40,000 and we can start renovations in the spring." Helen squeezed her hand. "I'm so glad you're here. I know galas aren't exactly—" "I'm happy to be here," Evelyn said, and mostly meant it. She circulated, she shook hands, she listened to a venture capitalist from Hartford explain a concept she had already turned down in a cleaner pitch 6 months ago, and she nodded with appropriate interest and excused herself when she saw her opening. She spoke briefly with a city councilwoman she genuinely liked. She donated quietly, routing it through Diane so the amount didn't become table conversation. By 9 o'clock, she had done what she came to do. She was calculating a graceful exit, maybe another 20 minutes, a brief goodbye to Helen, when she noticed the man standing near the far wall. Not noticed, exactly. He'd been there for a while. She'd registered him the way she registered furniture, a figure in dark work clothes, unremarkable at first glance, positioned near a service corridor with a tool bag on the floor beside him. Maintenance. Something with the A/V, probably, or the lighting rigs. He was nursing a water bottle, not a drink, watching the room without appearing to watch it. The way certain people looked at crowds, attentive without being interested, like someone who had learned to observe things carefully as a professional habit. He was large. That registered too, not in a way that made her uneasy, but in a way she noticed. Broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than a gym with a personal trainer. Late 30s, maybe. A face that had some weather in it. Not handsome exactly, just present, in a way that a lot of faces in the room weren't, behind all their careful presentation. She looked away, found a water station, checked her watch. That was when Harlan Voss arrived at her elbow. She had been hoping to avoid him all evening. Harlan Voss was 63, the founder of Voss Group, a private equity operation whose reputation depended heavily on intimidation and on the fact that most people in any given room owed him something. He had approached Viridian 6 weeks ago with a partnership proposal that Evelyn had read twice, consulted 2 attorneys about, and declined in writing. The proposal's core structure involved routing capital through a holding company with a liability shield she didn't trust, and a fee arrangement that benefited Voss Group disproportionately, regardless of performance. She had been polite in her decline. She had cited technical and strategic concerns. She had not said what she actually thought, which was that the deal smelled wrong. Evelyn. He said her name the way some men said it, like they were awarding her something. Harlan. Good evening. I didn't know you were coming tonight. He positioned himself so that turning away from him required a deliberate choice. He was good at that. We should talk. I don't think tonight's the right venue. She kept her voice neutral. I think I addressed everything thoroughly in my letter. You addressed it. He smiled. The smile had too many teeth in it. You didn't explain. I explained my concerns clearly. I'm happy to schedule. I've been doing this longer than you've been in business. He said it quietly, but the two people closest to them both went still. And I've never had a 30-year-old look at my numbers and decide she knows better. Evelyn kept her expression even. Then I'm the first. Good evening, Harlan. She started to move past him. He stepped sideways, not blocking her, not quite, but adjusting the geometry of it. And when she turned to face him, his voice had changed, dropped, gone harder, and loud enough now that the drift had stopped and several conversations in the immediate vicinity had gone quiet. What you did with that letter, he said, was an embarrassment. Not to me, to yourself. You're sitting on a firm with a ceiling and you're too proud or too stupid to take a hand when it's offered. I've watched people like you plateau, and I'm telling you, as a professional courtesy, that the reason you're struggling, I'm not struggling. She said it before she could decide whether to say it, is that you can't tell the difference between caution and fear. And what you sent me was a fear response dressed up in legal language. He let that land. Around them, the silence had spread. People were watching now. She could feel it. The specific quality of attention that a crowd gives to a car crash in progress, where everyone is waiting to see how bad it gets. I've seen it before. Women in your position who get far enough to think they've made it, and then freeze because the next level requires a different kind of courage. There it was. She had heard it before, in various forms. She had a response prepared. Had always had responses prepared for moments like this, because moments like this came. But what surprised her now was that the response that rose to the surface wasn't sharp. It was tired. She was tired. Not of him specifically, of the entire architecture of the thing, the way a room full of 300 people could watch this happen and calculate whether intervening was worth it. She opened her mouth. Excuse me. The voice came from her left, and it wasn't loud. That was the thing that she remembered later when she went over it, that it wasn't loud. It didn't have to be because it had the quality of someone who was accustomed to being heard when he spoke, not because of volume, but because of something in the delivery. Flat and direct and calm in a way that suggested the calm was the point, not a performance. The man in the maintenance clothes had moved from the wall. He stopped about 1.5 feet away from Voss, not between them exactly, but angled in a way that changed the geometry of the scene. He was holding his water bottle. He looked at Voss with the specific lack of expression that Evelyn would, much later, understand was a trained thing. Not blankness, exactly, but stillness. He did not look at her, which was the first thing she noticed. Most people in that moment would have glanced at her. He didn't. There a problem here? He said to Voss. Not aggressive, just a question. Voss looked at him the way he looked at anything that wasn't immediately legible as a threat or an asset, with the particular dismissal of someone who assessed value quickly and had assessed this one as low. Work clothes. No event badge. Tool bag. The math was fast and visible on his face. This is a private conversation, Voss said. I don't think anyone called for maintenance. Nobody did, the man said. I just heard the volume go up. Thought I'd make sure everyone was doing okay. We're fine, Voss's voice sharpened. This is a conversation between business professionals and you. Look like you work here, right? The man nodded, like he was used to that sentence. Yeah, I do. He said it without any particular edge, and somehow the lack of edge was worse than an edge would have been, because it was clear that whatever Voss had expected, defensiveness, embarrassment, retreat, wasn't coming. Then I'd suggest you get back to doing whatever it is you do. Voss's eyes went to Evelyn briefly, the way a hand gesture lands to indicate what's being dismissed. We're not finished. She looked like she might be, the man said. Simple. Just that. Voss stared at him. It was the stare of someone who had won a long time ago, in most rooms, by making people feel small, and who was encountering a technical difficulty with the usual approach. The man's expression didn't change. He was not performing confidence. He was not performing anything. He just stood there, steady, like he'd stood in harder places, and had a decent baseline for deciding what required adrenaline and what didn't. Do you know who I am? Voss said. Harlan Voss. The man said the name the same way he might have read a label. Voss Group. Your company did the Pembroke development. I know the project. Voss blinked. The retaining wall on the east side, the man said. That was a budget call, wasn't it? Poured in October, cold weather pour, and they went ahead anyway. I read the settlement. There was a moment. Evelyn wasn't entirely sure what had just happened, but she saw Voss's jaw move and then stop. I'm going to walk away now, the man said, looking at Voss, not at her, still. And I think this conversation is probably done. He said it without question marks. Then he looked at Evelyn for the first time, and it was a short look, matter of fact, just checking that she was all right, and then he looked away. Have a good evening. He walked back toward the wall. Harlan Voss stood for 2 seconds in the silence that the room had made around him. Then he said something under his breath that she didn't catch, adjusted his jacket, and left. Evelyn didn't move right away. Around her, the ambient noise of the ballroom was restoring itself, the way it always does after something happens. Conversations resuming, glasses lifting, the social fabric pulling itself back together. She was aware of her own heartbeat. Not panic, just the aftermath of standing in a position you hadn't chosen, in front of people who had watched, and coming out the other side of it. She turned toward the wall. He was back where he had started, water bottle in hand, looking at nothing in particular. Like nothing had happened. Like it had been a small thing, barely worth noting, and he had already moved on. She crossed the room toward him. Up close, he was more tired than she'd realized, or maybe tired wasn't the word. There was something in his face that read like a person who had been managing a lot for a long time and had made peace with it not getting easier. He was in his mid-30s, she thought, but carried it like someone older. Thank you, she said. He glanced at her, nodded once. That was a risky move, she added. For you, I mean. He has a reach. He has a bad habit, the man said. Not the same thing. She waited a beat, half expecting the follow-up. The name drop, the card, the offer that was actually a transaction. Nobody did something like that without expecting something back. In her experience. Not in rooms like this one. Mason Reed, he said. He didn't extend a hand, just offered the name like he was answering a question she hadn't asked. I'm handling the lighting setup in the back corridor. The Hartwell contract's out. Evelyn Cross. He nodded again. He knew the name, she could tell. But his expression didn't change in the way expressions usually changed when people realized who she was. The slight recalibration, the adjustment in posture, the performance of having recognized something valuable. None of that happened. You didn't have to do that, she said. No, he agreed. So why did you? He thought about it. Actually thought about it. Not the half-second pause before a prepared answer, but a real beat of consideration, like the question was worth taking seriously. Because nobody else was going to, he said finally. And it needed doing. He bent to pick up his tool bag. Have a good night, Ms. Cross. He moved toward the service corridor and was gone. Evelyn stood for a moment, holding her champagne flute, watching the empty doorway. Around her, the gala was accelerating toward its second hour. More arrivals, more murmuring, the auction preparations beginning near the stage. Helen was somewhere across the room, laughing with a group by the bar. The chandelier threw its amber light over everything, impartial as always. She thought about what he'd said, because nobody else was going to, and it needed doing. No calculation behind it. No angle she could find. Just a man in work clothes who'd decided a thing needed doing and had done it and walked back to his wall without waiting to see what he'd earned. She found her way to the donation station and doubled what she'd planned to give. And in the car home, staring at the city lights through the rain-blurred window, She kept coming back to the same thing. Not what Voss had said, which she'd heard in various forms her entire career, but the moment just before Mason Reed had spoken. The moment when 300 people in formal clothes had watched and calculated and decided it wasn't worth it. She had been calculating too. She was still thinking about what that meant when she finally fell asleep that night. Hours later, the gala program still on the kitchen counter where she'd dropped it. The face of a man she'd spoken to for 4 minutes still sitting somewhere in the back of her mind like an unresolved question. She told herself she wasn't looking for him. That was what Evelyn said to herself on the Thursday morning, 9 days after the Hartwell Gala, when she found herself parked on Clement Street in front of the Northside Community Center with her coffee going cold in the cup holder and her calendar blocked for 2 hours under the label site visit, personal. She had told Diane it was a foundation scouting trip, which was not entirely untrue. She was, in some professional capacity, always looking at organizations that Viridian's charitable arm might consider supporting. The fact that she had called Helen Marsh 3 days ago to ask, very casually, whether she knew anything about the volunteer programs at Northside, and that Helen had mentioned equally casually that a man named Mason Reed had been showing up there every Saturday and some Thursdays for the better part of 2 years, was simply background research. She was a thorough person. It was a professional quality. The community center was a converted brick building, 2 stories, with a painted mural on the south wall that had been touched up recently enough that the colors were still bright. Children's figures, abstract trees, a neighborhood rendered in primary colors by someone who was good at this but not a professional. The parking lot had 4 potholes that the city had clearly not gotten around to fixing. There was a hand-lettered sign near the entrance advertising a Saturday morning breakfast program and a Thursday evening GED prep class. Evelyn got out of the car. Inside, the center smelled like industrial cleaner and old wood floors, and from somewhere in the back, something being cooked, soup, maybe, or chili. A woman at the front desk, maybe 50, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looked up when Evelyn came through the door. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to look at the volunteer programs. I called earlier. I spoke with someone named Patricia." "That's me." Patricia looked her over, not unkindly but not deferentially either, in the way of someone who got a lot of well-dressed visitors with good intentions and had learned to take them at a measured pace. "You said you were interested in the facilities maintenance track and the family services side. I'd like to see both if that's possible." Patricia stood, pulled a laminated badge from a drawer. "You'll need to sign in, and you'll want to leave the heels at the door, figuratively speaking. We've got some outdoor work happening today, and the back courtyard's a mess." Evelyn signed the sheet. She had worn flats, actually. She'd thought about it. The tour took her through the main hall, where 3 women were sorting donated clothing into labeled bins, through a room set up with folding tables, where a man in his 20s was tutoring a teenage boy in what looked like algebra, and out through a side door into a long, open courtyard behind the building. There was a playground at the far end, or what was becoming one. The old equipment had been partially dismantled, rusted swing frame leaning against the fence, and new posts were being set into concrete that hadn't fully cured yet. Mason Reed was on one knee beside a post hole, checking the level. He had a daughter next to him, a girl of about 8, with 2 braids and paint-stained sneakers, who was holding a measuring tape with the focused expression of someone who had been given a real job and was taking it seriously. They were talking while he worked, though she couldn't hear it from this distance. He said something, and the girl looked at the level and said something back, and he nodded, made an adjustment, checked it again. Evelyn stopped walking. "That's Mason," Patricia said, without particular emphasis, like she was identifying a piece of equipment. "And his daughter, Lily. She's here most Thursdays after school. We've got a homework room, but half the time she just ends up out here with him." "How long has he been volunteering?" "Coming up on 2 years. He started on the maintenance side, just fixing things. We had a broken boiler, some wiring issues, and a leak in the gymnasium roof that 3 different contractors had quoted us wrong on. He sorted all of it." Patricia's voice carried the specific satisfaction of someone describing a debt she hadn't been able to repay adequately. "Then he started coming on Saturdays for the family breakfast. And then somehow he ended up running the playground project, which wasn't supposed to be his thing at all, but..." She shrugged. "He saw it needed doing." The phrase landed with a small, quiet weight. Evelyn walked toward the playground. He heard her coming, or registered her approach some other way. because he looked up when she was still 15 feet away, and his expression did the thing it had done at the gala. It didn't change much. Just a brief recalibration, a flicker of something she couldn't read. "Ms. Cross," he said, "Evelyn's fine." She stopped at what felt like a natural distance. "Patricia's been showing me around." "Yeah." He stood, brushed concrete dust off his knee. He was in work clothes again, canvas pants, a thermal shirt with the sleeves pushed up, boots that had seen several years of work. "You in the market for a community center?" "I'm exploring." She looked at the playground frame. "This is a significant project for a volunteer crew. It's mostly me and 2 other guys on weekends. Lily runs the supply list." He glanced at his daughter, who had become aware that someone new was there, and was watching Evelyn with the flat, direct curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to make it less obvious. "Hi," Lily said. "Hi." Evelyn crouched slightly, not all the way down, but enough to change the angle. "I'm Evelyn. Are you the one keeping the measurements? Dad says if the posts aren't plumb, the whole thing tilts, and then the swings don't work right." Lily held up the tape measure. "I've been checking every single one. That's important work." "I know." She said it matter-of-factly, not bragging, just stating a thing she'd been told and had decided to believe. Evelyn straightened. Mason was watching her, not the way men usually watched her in professional contexts, assessing, calculating, but in the way of someone trying to figure out why she was actually here. "You don't have to be careful about it," he said. "About what?" "Why you came." He picked up the level from the ground. "You could just say you were curious." "That's okay." She looked at him. "I was curious." "Okay." He set the level against the next post. "You want to hand me that?" He nodded at a bolt on the ground. She picked it up and handed it to him, and he took it without making it a moment, which she appreciated. "Does it bother you," she asked, "that I looked up where you were?" "Not really." He tightened the bolt. "I don't have much to hide. This is just what I do on Thursdays." "It's a lot." "It's a few hours." He glanced at her. "You came all the way down here on a Thursday afternoon. That's also a lot." She didn't have a clean answer to that, so she didn't try to manufacture one. Instead, she looked at the courtyard, at the half-built frame, at Lily, who had gone back to her measuring tape and was carefully unspooling it along the ground with the expression of someone performing surgery. "Can I help?" Evelyn asked. A pause. "You know how to mix concrete?" "No." "Can you hold a post level while I brace it?" "Yes." "Then, yeah," he said. "Gloves are in the red bin." That was how it started. She stayed for an hour and 40 minutes. She held posts while he braced them, handed tools when he asked, listened when he explained what he was doing and why, not explaining it the way some men explain things to women, with the slightly elevated volume that meant they assumed comprehension was in question, but the way someone talked when they were thinking out loud and happened to have an audience. Lily relocated her tape measure operation to be closer to Evelyn, and somewhere in the second hour started narrating her measurements directly to her instead of to herself. 6 feet 2 inches, Lily announced. "That's the same as the last one." "Good." "Dad says they have to be consistent or the platform won't sit flat." "Your dad knows a lot about building things." Lily considered this. "He knows a lot about a lot of things. He doesn't talk about most of it." She said it the way children said true things, without editorial, without the softening that adults applied to observations that might be taken as criticism. "He says most stuff doesn't need to be talked about. It just needs to get done." Evelyn looked across at Mason, who was tightening a cross brace and had not appeared to hear this, though she suspected he had. When she left, at 5:15, Lily waved. Mason walked her to the edge of the courtyard and said he'd see her around in the same tone he would have used to say goodbye to anyone. She drove back toward the city with concrete dust on her sleeve and found she was not in the mood to think strategically about anything for the rest of the evening. The following Saturday, she came back. She had told herself she wouldn't, or rather she had not told herself she would, which was a different thing. But Saturday morning arrived, and her calendar was clear until noon, and she found herself in the car on Clement Street again at 8:45 with coffee that was actually still hot. The Saturday breakfast program was a different register entirely. The main hall had been reconfigured with rows of tables, and by 9 o'clock there were nearly 40 people eating, families mostly, some single mothers with small children, a handful of older men who came regularly enough that they had preferred seats. Mason was in the kitchen. She discovered this when Patricia pointed her toward the serving line, and she found him there, ladling scrambled eggs into trays with the focused attention he apparently gave to everything, carrying on a conversation simultaneously with a woman who was recounting, at some length, a problem she was having with her landlord. "He says the heater's not his responsibility because it's a window unit," the woman said. She had a toddler on her hip and was balancing a tray with her free hand. "Window unit is typically tenant responsibility if it's tenant-owned," Mason said. "But if it came with the unit when you moved in, that's different. You have your lease copy?" "Somewhere." "Find it. The language should say provided appliances. If the heater's listed there, he's responsible for it. If you need help reading through it, Patricia can connect you with the legal aid guy who comes on Wednesdays." The woman nodded, took her tray, moved on. Mason looked up and saw Evelyn in the line and handed her a plate without comment. "You're a paralegal too?" she said. "I'm not anything," he said. "I just pay attention." She took her plate and sat where there was space and ate breakfast with strangers, which she had not done since college, and found that it was fine. Better than fine. There was a simplicity to it. The food was plain and good. The conversation around her was ordinary. A mother trying to keep her 3-year-old from putting eggs in his hair, and no one in the room was performing anything. After the meal was cleared and the tables were being wiped down, Evelyn found herself washing dishes at the large industrial sink alongside a woman named Gloria, who was in her 60s and had strong opinions about the correct way to stack pans and shared them freely. Mason passed through twice, carrying crates, and on the second pass, Gloria called out to him. "Lily's at the homework table. She says she needs help with fractions." "I'll be there in 10, he called back. "I said that 20 minutes ago," Gloria said, to no one. Then to Evelyn, "He does too much, always has. Comes in here every Saturday since his wife passed, him and that little girl." Evelyn rinsed a pan. "How long ago did she pass?" 3 years almost. Car accident. Lily was 5. Gloria handed her another pan. "He doesn't talk about it, but you can see it sometimes when Lily does something and he gets this look like he's doing math in his head, figuring the distance between what is and what was supposed to be." She stacked the pan herself because Evelyn was holding it a beat too long. "You two know each other?" "A little. We met at an event a couple weeks ago." But Gloria's tone was the tone of someone who had heard a couple weeks ago and was tracking something different. "He's a good man, not perfect. Gets too closed off sometimes. Carries things he should probably put down." She handed over a serving spoon. "But good." Evelyn kept washing. She found Mason at the homework table around 10:30. He was sitting across from Lily with a piece of paper between them, working through fractions the long way, without shortcuts, asking Lily to explain each step back to him before they moved to the next. "But why does the denominator stay the same?" Lily was asking, with the slightly aggrieved tone of someone who wanted an answer, not another question. "Because you're cutting the same pie," Mason said. "If the pie has 8 pieces and you eat 2 of them and I eat 3 of them, we're still talking about pieces of the same pie." "What if I didn't want to share the pie?" "That's a different problem." "Dad." "Lily." She made a noise. "Fine. The denominator stays the same because we're cutting the same pie." "Right." He wrote it out for her. "Do the next one." Evelyn sat down at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee she'd poured from the community pot, and pulled out her phone and did not technically intrude. But the table was small enough that the radius of their work overlapped hers, and at some point Lily looked up from her worksheet and said, "Do you know fractions?" "I do." "Dad says I have to figure it out myself so I actually understand it." "Your dad's right." Lily looked at her father. "She agrees with you." "Most people do," he said without looking up from what he was marking. "Eventually." Evelyn laughed. She hadn't been expecting to, and it came out surprised, and when she looked at Mason, he was almost smiling, which was different from smiling, but not entirely unlike it. Those Saturdays accumulated. She missed one in mid-March because she had a board call that ran long, and she spent the rest of that day with an irritation she couldn't fully explain. She came back the following week, and Gloria said, "There she is," in the tone of someone marking attendance, and Mason handed her a plate and said, "Eggs are cold today, sorry," and she ate cold eggs and was unreasonably fine with it. What she noticed over those weeks was the texture of how he moved through the place. He didn't run things. There was no official leadership structure that she could identify, no moment where someone said Mason's in charge. And yet when something broke, people came to him. When a disagreement about table arrangements broke out between two volunteers, he said 3 sentences and the thing resolved, and no one seemed particularly aware that he'd intervened. He repaired the south-facing window in the TV room on a Tuesday afternoon and put a new weather strip on the back door because he had noticed it was letting cold air in, not because anyone had asked. When a family came in during their 3rd Saturday together, and it was clear the father had just lost his job, it was written in the set of his shoulders, the way his wife kept touching his arm like she was reassuring herself he was still there. Mason brought him coffee and sat with him for 20 minutes and did not appear to say anything remarkable. But the man's shoulders were different when Mason stood up. She asked him about it afterward, when Lily had gone to play with another girl her age, and they were carrying folding tables back to the storage room. "What did you say to him?" "Earlier, the man with the gray jacket." "Robert," Mason said. "He got laid off from the shipping company last week. Plant closure." "What did you say to him?" He set the table down, thought about it. "I told him the breakfast program runs 5 days a week and nobody asks questions, and that I knew a guy at a logistics company in the industrial corridor who owes me a favor and might be worth a call, and that his kids looked like they were doing fine." "That's all?" "Sometimes that's what someone needs to hear." He lifted another table. "That the practical stuff has a next step, and that the thing they're most scared of, the kids, the ripple effect, isn't as bad as it looks yet." Evelyn held the door. "You do this all the time." "Do what?" "Figure out what people actually need, underneath the thing they're asking about." He considered this with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "I spent a long time in situations where reading people wrong had real consequences," he said. "You get into the habit." She didn't push on that. She'd been careful, since those first weeks, not to push on the parts of him that he hadn't opened himself. The military history she'd inferred from scattered things, the particular way he scanned rooms, the reaction time at the gala. She figured he'd tell her what he wanted to tell her. He did, eventually, on a Thursday evening in late March, when they ended up at the small diner 2 blocks from the community center because Lily had declared she wanted a grilled cheese and Mason had said he wasn't going to fight about it. The 3 of them sat in a booth, Lily on one side with her grilled cheese and a chocolate milk she was consuming with great ceremony, and Evelyn and Mason on the other side with coffee that was diner coffee. Not good, but hot. And something that Evelyn was realizing she didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't dating. They hadn't made anything of it. He had never looked at her the way she'd started, privately and with some annoyance at herself, to notice she was looking at him. But it was something, at ease, the kind that usually required more time. "Lily said you were in the military," Evelyn said. She set her cup down. "She mentioned it once. I don't know if that's something you talk about." Across from them, Lily had become intensely focused on her sandwich. "She did, huh?" Mason said. He looked at his daughter. "You're eating." "I can eat and hear things at the same time," Lily said into her sandwich. He exhaled. To Evelyn, "Navy, 8 years. SEAL teams for the last 4. "When did you get out?" 3 years ago." He turned his cup in his hands. After my wife died, I was still deployed. I got back in time for the service, and then I had a 6-month-old. No, Lily was 5 by then." He corrected himself quietly, and she understood from the way he did it that he still sometimes lost the timeline, that the math of that period still scrambled occasionally. "I had a 5-year-old who'd just lost her mother, and I was shipping out every 8 months and leaving her with my sister. It wasn't something I could keep doing." "So you left?" "I got out." He said it the way people said things that were hard and that they'd made peace with, but that still had some weight to them. Wasn't easy, but it was the right call. Lily needed a parent who was actually there. Evelyn looked at Lily, who had finished the first half of her sandwich and was now pulling the crusts off the second with focused attention. "She's going to grow up knowing you chose her," Evelyn said. Mason looked at her. It was the longest he'd held her gaze directly, in all the weeks she'd been coming to the center, and there was something in it she wasn't prepared to name. "She's all I've got," he said. Simply, just that. Lily looked up. "I want a milkshake." You have chocolate milk. I want both. That's not. He stopped, looked at Evelyn. Help me out here. I'm staying out of the milkshake negotiation, Evelyn said. That's cowardly. I'm a cautious person. The corner of his mouth moved. You drove to a construction site and work flats on a Thursday in March because you were curious. That's not cautious. I made a strategic decision to investigate a potentially valuable community partnership. And the concrete on your sleeve that day? Workplace hazard. Lily was looking between them with the expression of a child watching a tennis match and following it perfectly while pretending not to. Can I get the milkshake? She said to Evelyn. That's your dad's call. He'll say yes if you think it's okay. Mason looked at the ceiling. That is absolutely not how this works. But he ordered the milkshake. Walking back to their cars afterward, Lily between them, but drifting ahead in the way of children who were not quite ready to stop the evening, Mason said quietly. She likes you. I like her. He nodded. She doesn't warm up to people fast. Since Sarah, she's been careful. She has good instincts. He glanced at her sideways. Yeah, he said. I think so too. They reached the parking lot, and Lily had circled back to them and was pulling on Mason's hand and asking if they could look at the playground progress on the way to the car. And he said, yeah, okay, 5 minutes, and they took the long way around the back of the community center, the three of them walking in the Thursday evening cold, and the playground frame stood half-finished in the dark, all its new posts straight and level. And Evelyn stood looking at it and thought that she had not expected to be here. Not this version of here, this specific, unpredicted place. And that she was, despite everything, deeply glad she was. What she didn't know, walking back to her car that night with Lily's voice still carrying through the cold air as she told Mason about something that had happened at school involving a substitute teacher and a misplaced hamster. What she didn't know was that 2 floors up in the Viridian Capitol building, in a meeting that had not been calendared through official channels, 4 of her 7 board members had met for coffee that afternoon. And that Harlan Voss, who had made a phone call in the week after the gala, had been thorough about it, and that what was coming would not wait very much longer. The call came on a Monday. Evelyn was in the middle of a budget review when Diane appeared in the doorway with the expression she used for things that required immediate attention but were not fires. A specific tightening around the eyes, the kind of look that said, this is above my pay grade to filter. Richard Holt is here, Diane said. He doesn't have an appointment. Richard Holt was Viridian's chairman of the board. He was 61, a careful man, the kind who wore the same style of suit in slightly different shades of gray because he had identified the optimal presentation and saw no reason to revisit it. He had been chairman for 9 years. He had, in Evelyn's 4 years as CEO, never once shown up at her office without scheduling it first. Send him in, she said. He came in with the look of someone who had rehearsed the conversation on the way over and was not entirely happy with any of the versions. He sat down across from her without being asked, which told her something. He set his phone face down on the desk, which told her more. I'm going to be direct with you, he said. Please. There's been a conversation among some of the board members, not a formal meeting, nothing on the record, but a conversation. She waited. It's about the community center. He said it carefully. The volunteer work. The visibility. The visibility. You've been photographed twice in the past month at the Northside Center, once by what appears to be a parent with a phone camera, once by a local neighborhood blog. The second one got picked up by a business column. He set a printed page on her desk. She recognized the photo. She was in the courtyard, holding a level, her jacket off, hair not particularly organized. Mason was 2 feet away, bracing a post. They were both looking at the frame. We look like people building a playground, she said. You look like the CEO of Viridian Capital doing manual labor with an unidentified man at a community center in a part of the city our investors don't typically associate with us. His voice was even, not unkind, but very clear. Some of the board members are concerned about the optics. Which board members? A pause. Douglas raised it first. Carmela and Tom were in the conversation. Douglas Fenn, Carmela Reyes, Tom Whitfield. 3 of the 7, not a majority. But 3 was enough to make noise, and Richard Holt sitting in her office on a Monday without an appointment meant the noise was already loud. And Harlan Voss called Douglas 2 weeks ago, she said. It wasn't a question. Richard looked at her for a moment. I don't know the specifics of their conversations, but you know there was one. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He picked up his phone from the desk and turned it once in his hand. Evelyn, I want to be clear. I am not here to tell you what to do with your personal time, but I am here because I think you need to hear this directly, and I would rather you hear it from me than from Douglas in a formal board session. He met her eyes. The question some people are asking is about judgment, not the volunteer work itself, but the association, and whether it reflects a set of priorities that is misaligned with where Viridian needs to be heading. She kept her voice flat. The association with what, exactly? With a community center? With a man whose background they don't know and whose connection to you they don't understand. She looked at the photograph on her desk. She and Mason, side by side, both looking at the same thing. His name is Mason Reed. He's a former Navy SEAL. He's a single father. He volunteers at that center every week. He is, she stopped, recalibrated. He's someone I respect. I understand. And I'm having trouble understanding how my personal life constitutes a board concern. It's not your personal life, Richard said, with the precision of a man who had chosen every word carefully before arriving. It's the optics of the CEO of a capital management firm positioning herself publicly in a context that some investors read as incongruent with the brand. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city was doing what it did. Traffic, a delivery truck, the hum of 10,000 things moving at once. Thank you for telling me directly, she said finally. I want you to think about it. That's all I'm asking. After he left, she sat with the photograph for a long time. Then she put it face down on the desk and went back to the budget review, and did not do a good job of it for the remainder of the afternoon. She didn't tell Mason that week. She came to the Saturday breakfast and held it in the back of her mind while she ladled coffee and helped Gloria with the dish cycle. And she watched him sit with Robert from the shipping plant, who had called the logistics contact and had an interview scheduled. And she thought about Richard Holt's face and the phrase brand incongruity and the distance between the two rooms she was apparently expected to keep separate. She told him the following Thursday. They were in the courtyard, which had progressed significantly. The frame was up, the platform boards were being set, and the shape of the actual playground was visible now in a way that made the project feel real and finite, like something that would actually exist when they were done. Lily was inside at the homework table. It was the two of them, late afternoon, the light going orange over the roofline. Some of my board members have concerns, she said, about me being here, about being seen here, with you. He set down the drill. He looked at her without surprise, which told her he'd been waiting for some version of this. Okay, he said. Harlan Voss made some calls. Figured. She watched his face. You don't seem bothered. I'm bothered, he said. I'm just not surprised. He picked up a platform board, measured it against the frame. What are you going to do? The question was direct. Not pressuring, not plaintive, just asking. What are you going to do? Like it was a practical problem, same as the platform boards. Something with a right answer that required measurement. I don't know yet, she said. I wanted to tell you because it affects you. If this gets louder, if Voss pushes the board harder, your name will end up in it. My name's already in it. He said it without bitterness. The moment I stepped in at the gala, it was in it. That's fine. It's not fine, she said. You didn't ask for this. Neither did you. He looked at her. You didn't ask for Voss either. He just decided to make you a problem because you said no to him, and now he's working an angle. He went back to the board. That's about him, not about you, and not about this. He gestured at the courtyard. This is just a playground. I know. And you've been coming here because you wanted to, not because of some strategy. I know. So, he held the board against the frame. The question is what you're willing to protect. She heard that. It landed differently than she'd expected, not as judgment, not as pressure, but as an actual question, one she didn't have a quick answer to. She picked up the other end of the board and held it level. He drilled it without saying anything else, and they worked in the particular quiet that had become natural between them over these weeks. Not silence exactly, just two people who had gotten comfortable enough that the space between sentences didn't need to be filled. What she didn't say, holding that end of the board, that she had thought about little else since Monday. That she had opened the Viridian board charter at 2 in the morning on Tuesday and read through the removal procedures with the specific attention of someone who hoped they wouldn't need the information and needed it anyway. That she had called an attorney she trusted, off the record, and been told what she already knew. That her position was solid as long as the board didn't move as a block, and that keeping the block from forming was a political problem, not a legal one. That the person she'd most wanted to talk to about all of it was the person she was standing next to. The pressure didn't stay quiet for long. 2 weeks later, Douglas Fenn requested a formal agenda item at the next board meeting. The language in the filing was careful, strategic brand alignment review, but Diane read it the same way Evelyn did and set a box of tissues on Evelyn's desk as a gesture that Evelyn chose to interpret as confidence rather than condolence. The board meeting was on a Thursday. Evelyn prepared for it the way she prepared for everything that mattered, thoroughly, without drama, with a clear accounting of what she knew and what she didn't. She pulled Viridian's performance data for the last 18 months. She pulled the industry comparison numbers. She pulled the press coverage of the North Side visits, which amounted to one neighborhood blog post and a single photograph in a business column caption. And she set it all in front of her and looked at it. The numbers were good. She knew that. By any honest metric, return on investment, client retention, market positioning, Viridian under her leadership had performed well. There was no line on any document that pointed to the community center as a liability. The argument being constructed against her was not a financial argument, it was a social one. And social arguments, in her experience, had a particular texture. They moved through rooms without being clearly stated, they gathered mass from implication, and they were hardest to defend against because there was no document you could pull to refute them. Douglas Fenn called her the evening before the board meeting. She let it go to voicemail once, then called back. Evelyn? He was cordial. Douglas was always cordial. Cordiality was his instrument. I wanted to reach out before tomorrow. I appreciate it. I want you to know this isn't personal. I know, she said, with the tone she used when she meant the opposite and wanted the other person to know she meant the opposite. A beat. The concern I have, and I want to be precise about this, is about the message, not the content of what you're doing. The message it sends, about our priorities, our demographic. Our investors, Evelyn, the people who put their capital with us because they believe we understand their world. His voice was measured, practiced. When the CEO of a capital management firm is photographed in work clothes at a community center in, frankly, a neighborhood that our investors don't associate with us, the question that gets raised is, does she still understand what she's managing? Does she still understand what matters to us? The conversation lasted 11 more minutes. When it ended, she set the phone on her kitchen counter and stood looking at it for a moment. Then she called Mason. He picked up on the third ring. She could hear in the background Lily's voice and what sounded like a television at low volume, the small specific sounds of an evening at home. Hey, he said. Hey, she exhaled. Is this a bad time? Hold on. A moment, the sound of movement, a door, and then quiet. No, what's going on? She told him about Douglas's call. She kept it factual, the language used, the positioning, what she expected at the meeting tomorrow. When she was done, there was a brief silence. What do you want? Mason said. What? Not what they want. What do you want tomorrow when you walk into that room? She hadn't put it to herself exactly that way. She had been thinking about tactics, what to present, how to position it, which board members were movable and which weren't. She had not stopped to ask the foundational question. I want to keep my company, she said. And I don't want to pretend that the last few months didn't happen. Those two things compatible? I don't know yet. Okay? A pause. For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth a lot in a board meeting, I don't think you're doing anything wrong. Going somewhere and helping out and being a person, I don't think that's a brand problem. Douglas Fenn would disagree. Douglas Fenn has probably never held a post level in his life. She laughed, which surprised her. It was the third or fourth time he'd surprised her into laughing, and she was starting to think it was less accidental than it seemed. How's Lily? She said. She's mad at me because I wouldn't let her stay up past 9. That's a fair grievance? That's the position of someone who doesn't have to get her to school at 7:30. Also fair. She leaned against the counter. I'll let you go. Evelyn. His voice shifted slightly, not dramatic, just grounded. You know your own mind. Walk in there tomorrow and say the thing you actually think, not the version that protects the perimeter. She held the phone for a moment after she hung up, standing in her kitchen, and thought that no one had said anything quite that useful to her in a professional capacity in a very long time, and that he had said it like it was obvious, the way he said most things. The board meeting went poorly and also better than she'd expected, which was the kind of outcome that felt like neither victory nor defeat. Douglas presented his concern with the same careful language he'd used on the phone. Carmela nodded along. Tom Whitfield added some observations about institutional image that were long on tone and short on substance. Richard Holt sat at the head of the table with his hands folded and said nothing for the first 40 minutes, which was itself a statement. Evelyn let them finish. Then she opened the folder in front of her, the performance data, the numbers, the 18 months of results, and she walked through it the way she would have walked through any other strategic review, methodically, without defensiveness, without apology. She laid out what Viridian had done under her leadership and what it had not done and where it was positioned against its peer group, and she let the numbers sit. I'm going to be direct about what I'm hearing, she said when the data was on the table. The concern is not about performance. The performance is demonstrably sound. The concern is about where I choose to spend my personal time and who I spend it with. And I want to name that clearly, because I think we owe each other that kind of precision. Douglas started to speak. She held up one hand, not aggressively, just indicating she wasn't done. I have been volunteering at Northside Community Center. I intend to continue. The man in that photograph is someone I know and respect, and his work and character are not things I am willing to have characterized as a liability by inference. She looked at Douglas, then at Carmela. If the board has concerns about the firm's performance, I am here every day to address them. If the concern is that I am a CEO who helps repair a playground on weekends, then I think we may have a difference of values rather than a difference of strategy, and I would rather that be on the record than treated as a subtext. Silence. Richard Holt unfolded his hands. I'd like to table this item for the quarter, he said. I think Evelyn's response addresses the operational substance, and I don't believe we have a basis for further action at this time. He looked around the table with the calm authority of a man who had been doing this long enough to know when a conversation was over. Any objection? There was not. The meeting moved to its next item. Douglas made a note on his pad and did not look at her. Carmela poured water from the carafe. Tom checked his phone. Evelyn walked out of the building 40 minutes later and stood on the sidewalk and took a long breath of cold air and did not feel triumphant because it hadn't been a triumph. It had been a holding action. She had held the line for now, and Richard's intervention had helped, and she was aware that Harlan Voss had not stopped making phone calls and would not stop. She texted Mason from the sidewalk. It's okay for now. 3 minutes later, her phone buzzed. Good. Lily wants to know if you're coming Saturday. She looked at the message. Then she typed back. Tell Lily yes. She started walking toward the parking garage. The city was doing its middle-of-the-day thing around her. Foot traffic, a food cart sending steam into the cold air, someone arguing on a phone 2 storefronts down. Ordinary and constant and indifferent to board meetings. What she felt, walking through it, was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief exactly. Something harder to name. The specific internal register of a person who has said the true thing in a room that expected something else, and who is still standing afterward, and who doesn't entirely know what comes next, but knows, with reasonable certainty, that they were pointing in the right direction. She came back to Northside on Saturday. Mason was already in the kitchen when she arrived. The playground was almost finished. Another weekend, maybe 2, and they'd be done. Lily was at the breakfast table eating oatmeal and reading a book propped against the sugar dispenser, and she looked up when Evelyn came through the door and said hi, with the particular economy of a child who considers further greeting unnecessary between people who see each other regularly. Evelyn sat across from her, poured coffee, and thought that this table and this kitchen and this ordinary Saturday morning had become one of the fixed points of her week in a way she hadn't planned for and couldn't quite account for, and was no longer interested in explaining. Mason came out of the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder and looked at her with the look that she'd learned meant he was checking that she was okay without asking directly. She gave him the small nod that meant she was. He went back to the kitchen. Gloria sat down with her own coffee and said, "The egg tray's crooked again," in the tone of someone lodging a formal complaint, and Evelyn got up to look at it. And the morning began the way mornings there always began. And outside the courtyard, the playground frame stood almost complete in the early April light, all its posts plumb and level, the platform boards solid and true. What was gathering, though, in the offices of Douglas Fenn, in the phone calls Harlan Voss made from his car, in the quiet machinery of institutional pressure, what was gathering was not done gathering. The board meeting had been a pause, not a resolution, and Voss was the kind of man who treated delays as information, who used the time between moves to find the angle he hadn't tried yet. He found it on a Wednesday evening in the third week of April, in a conversation with a financial journalist named Carter Blaine, who wrote for a publication that Viridian's most significant investors read every morning without fail. And by Friday, the story was filed. And by Saturday morning, Evelyn's phone had 47 notifications when she woke up, and the headline that the journalist had chosen, CEO of Viridian Capital, Community Service or Loss of Focus, was sitting at the top of every financial news aggregator that her investors checked with their first cup of coffee. She sat on the edge of her bed and read it. Her name was in the second paragraph. Mason's name was in the fourth, with his job title, maintenance worker, italicized in a way that was not accidental. The piece quoted two anonymous sources described as investors familiar with Viridian's board deliberations and raised the question of whether a capital management firm's CEO could be trusted to maintain professional rigor while publicly cultivating a personal life at apparent odds with the firm's institutional identity. It was careful enough to be unprovable and specific enough to do damage. She put the phone down, looked at the window. Outside, the morning was starting without her opinion on the matter. Early light, the suggestion of traffic building on the avenue below, a city doing what it always did. She thought about Mason's voice on the phone that evening before the board meeting. Say the thing you actually think, not the version that protects the perimeter. She had done that in the board meeting. She had said the true thing, and the perimeter had held just barely for one round. The question that sat with her now, as the morning came in through the window and her phone kept buzzing, was whether she was willing to keep saying it in larger rooms, at louder volumes, with more at stake. She already knew the answer. She'd known it, if she was being honest, since a man in a maintenance uniform had stepped away from a wall in a ballroom and done a thing that needed doing without asking what it was worth. She picked up her phone, called Diane. "Clear my afternoon on Monday," she said. "I need to draft something." "Draft what?" Diane asked. "A speech," Evelyn said, "for the leadership conference." The draft took 4 days. Not because the words were hard to find. They came, actually, with a directness that surprised her, the way things came when you stopped trying to be careful about them. What took 4 days was the process of deciding how honest to be. Each morning, she sat at the kitchen table before the workday started and read what she'd written the night before, and each morning she had the same argument with herself. How much of the true thing could she say in a room full of people whose money was the foundation of everything she'd built? And how much would she sand down to make it palatable? And what did sanding it down make her? She sent 3 versions to Diane. Diane read all 3 and called her back within 20 minutes. "The third one," Diane said, "that's the most... I know what it is. It's also the only one that sounds like you actually mean it." A pause. "The first 2 sound like you're apologizing." "You're not apologizing, are you?" Evelyn looked at the third draft on her screen. "No." "Then the third one." The Viridian Capital Annual Leadership Conference was held every May at the Carver Center, a converted event space in the financial district with good acoustics in a main hall that seated 400. It was 2 days of panels, presentations, breakout sessions, the kind of event that existed primarily to reinforce relationships between the firm and its institutional stakeholders, to give investors a feeling of access and alignment, and to give Viridian's senior team a visible platform. Evelyn had opened it every year since she became CEO, with a 15-minute keynote that typically covered market positioning, strategic direction, a few carefully chosen anecdotes about the firm's culture and values. The tone was always assured and moderately warm. The applause was always polite. She had never said anything at it that cost her anything. The week leading up to the conference, the Carter Blaine article was still circulating. It had generated pickup in two other publications, both of which ran short items that added no new information but amplified the underlying narrative. The question mark hanging over Evelyn's judgment, the implied incompatibility between who she was at work and who she appeared to be becoming outside it. She fielded 3 calls from investors who phrased their concerns politely and meant them seriously. She had Diane send holding responses. The CEO appreciates your note and will be in touch directly. And she did not call any of them back, not because she was avoiding them, but because she was waiting until she had something worth saying. On the Monday before the conference, Mason texted her, "You good?" She stared at the text for a moment in the middle of a budget call, which was probably not the professional standard she would have held anyone else to. "Ask me Thursday," she typed back. 3 dots appeared, disappeared. Then, "Okay." She put the phone away and went back to the budget call. The night before the conference, she did not sleep well, not badly either. She wasn't anxious exactly, but something was running underneath everything, a low current of alertness that wouldn't fully switch off. She lay in the dark and thought about the speech, not rehearsing it, just sitting with it, the way you sat with a decision that was already made. She thought about Richard Holt, who had called her that afternoon. He had not told her what to say tomorrow, which was its own kind of message. "I've read the draft," he'd said. "And?" A pause. "It's good, Evelyn. It's the kind of thing that can go very wrong or very right." "I know. Which way it goes depends partly on the room, and partly on whether I mean it." "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "Then say it like that." Another pause. "I'll be in the front row. I won't be the only person paying attention." She arrived at the Carver Center at 7:15, 90 minutes before the keynote. The setup crew was still running cables and the coffee stations weren't fully operational, and the main hall smelled the way event spaces smelled before the crowd arrived. Neutral, slightly stale, waiting to be inhabited. She walked the stage. She looked out at the empty seats. She had done this before every significant presentation since her first year at the firm. Walked the empty room, gotten the geometry of it into her body before the people arrived. The room filled by 8:45. She stood in a side corridor and watched through a narrow window as the seats populated. Investors, fund managers, partners, a section of Viridian's own senior team. She recognized faces throughout. Douglas Fenn was in the 5th row. Carmelo Reyes sat 2 seats to his right. Harlan Voss was not in the room, which she'd expected. His name was not on the attendee list, had never been, but she'd scanned it twice anyway. She found Diane at her elbow. 2 minutes, Diane said. "Okay. You need water?" "I'm fine." Diane looked at her with the expression she used when she thought Evelyn was understating something but had decided not to press it. "You look good," she said. "Whatever that's worth." "It's worth something," Evelyn said. The introduction was handled by Marcus Webb, Viridian's head of investor relations, who was professionally enthusiastic in the way of someone who had written and delivered many introductions and had perfected the form. He mentioned the firm's recent performance numbers. He mentioned Evelyn's tenure, the growth percentage, the market context. He said she was a leader who embodied the values that made Viridian exceptional. The audience applauded with the warmth of people who were well-fed and had their coffee and were in a reasonably good mood. She walked out onto the stage. The applause was the standard variety. She stepped to the podium. She set her notes down. 3 pages, double-spaced, with her handwriting in the margins where she'd made last-minute adjustments. She looked out at the room. She said, "I want to start by telling you something I wasn't planning to say in the speech until about 4 days ago." The room shifted slightly. Not visibly. Nobody moved. But there was a change in the quality of attention, a slight increase in density. This conference exists, fundamentally, to have an honest conversation about where this firm is and where it's going. And I've been thinking about what honest actually requires of me today, given the past few weeks. She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time, not long enough to feel dramatic, long enough to be accurate. Some of you have read the article in the Blaine piece. Some of you have heard conversations about whether my recent choices reflect good judgment. I want to address that. Not defensively, just directly. She looked out at the room. Douglas Fenn was watching her with the expression of a man doing rapid calculation. I want to tell you about the night last October when I attended the Hartwell Children's Gala. She moved one page aside. Most of you know what happened there in a general sense. Something about an altercation, Harlan Voss, security involvement. What you probably don't know, because it wasn't the story anyone wrote, is what I noticed in the 30 seconds between when Harlan Voss began publicly berating me and when the only person in that room did something about it. She paused. In those 30 seconds, 300 people, investors, executives, professionals, people who have built careers on the idea that their judgment is sound, 300 people made a calculation. They looked at the situation and they weighed it, and they decided that the cost of intervening was higher than the cost of staying still. I know that calculation. I've made versions of it. We all have. It's the rational response. The room was very quiet now. The man who didn't make that calculation was not an investor. He was not a fund manager or a partner or an executive of anything. He was a maintenance worker who happened to be on site that night. He walked across the room, stood where he needed to stand, said what needed to be said, and then walked back to his wall and went back to work. No audience, no outcome he was angling toward. He just thought a thing needed doing, so he did it. She looked down at her notes for a moment, then back up. His name is Mason Reed. He's a former Navy SEAL. He's a single father raising an 8-year-old daughter on a maintenance worker's income. And for the past several months, he's been volunteering every week at the Northside Community Center, rebuilding a playground and running a family breakfast program and doing 100 other things that no one is paying him for. She paused. I've been there too. That's what the photograph shows. That's what some members of this firm's board described as a brand concern. She heard the room shift again, a different quality this time. Here is what I want to say about that. Not as a defense. As a statement of where I stand. She moved to the second page. I have run this firm for 4 years. In those 4 years, we have delivered consistent returns in a market that has been unkind to many of our peer institutions. I am proud of that, and I intend to continue it. The performance data is in your packets, and it speaks clearly. I don't need to sell you on the work. She let that sit. But I want to be honest with you about something I have been learning in rooms very different from this one. Something I think is relevant to this firm and to everyone in this room who has a stake in what kind of institution Viridian is. She stepped slightly away from the podium. Not far. She wasn't a pacer, never had been. Just enough to close a fraction of the distance between herself and the room. Leadership is not a credential, she said. It's not a title or a salary band or a seat yet at the right table. It's a behavior. It's the thing you do when the calculation says stay still and something in you says this needs doing. I've built my understanding of that concept over years of business school and 4 years running this firm, and I thought I had a reasonably complete picture of it. She stopped. I was wrong. My picture was missing the clearest example of it I have ever encountered, and I found it in a man in work clothes at a community center, showing up every week to do unglamorous things for people who had no way to repay him, in a part of the city where nobody was taking photographs and nobody was keeping score. She looked at Douglas Fenn. She didn't plan to. She just did. There is a version of this speech where I reassure you that my personal associations won't affect the firm's performance, that I understand the optics, that I'm committed to the kind of leadership that protects our institutional image. I can give you that speech. But it wouldn't be the true thing. The true thing is this. I think we have gotten some things confused. I think we have mistaken performance for character, and image for integrity. And I think the reason that's easy to do is that the gap between them is often invisible until it suddenly isn't. She let a beat pass. I am not willing to disavow a person of integrity because his work is blue collar. I'm not willing to treat a man's character as a liability because he doesn't fit the demographic our investors associate with this firm. And I want to say that plainly because I think the alternative, the version where I quietly step away from the community center and let the story die and protect the perimeter, is exactly the kind of calculation that produced a room full of 300 silent people at a charity gala. And I don't want to be that room. The hall was completely still. Not the polite, anticipatory stillness of a well-managed audience. Something quieter and more uncertain than that. The stillness of a room that wasn't sure yet what it was hearing. She went back to the podium. Third page. "Let me tell you what Viridian is going to do," she said, and her voice shifted back into the register of the CEO, grounded and specific, because she had learned a long time ago that the move after the vulnerable moment was not more vulnerability, it was clarity. "We are going to continue to perform. We are going to continue to deliver for our investors, and I am going to be in this office every day making sure that happens. That is not in question." She moved through the next section: market positioning, the Q3 initiatives, the 2 partnership developments that represented real new opportunities. She gave them the substance, all of it, with the same rigor she always brought to the conference. She could feel the room restoring its equilibrium, and she let it, because she needed them to leave with both things: the things she'd said, and the evidence that she was still the person who could deliver. At the end, she set down the last page. "One more thing," she said. "The playground at the Northside Community Center is going to be finished in about 2 weeks. I'll be there when it is. If any of you want to come and see what good work actually looks like, not the kind that gets managed in this room, but the kind that gets built with your hands because you decided it needed to be there, you're welcome." A beat. "Thank you for your time." She stepped back. The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. Then Richard Holt, front row, stood up. He was not a demonstrative man. She had never seen him give a standing ovation in 9 years. He stood up and put his hands together, and whatever signal that sent moved through the room in a wave she couldn't fully track. 2 people in the 3rd row, then 6, then a cluster near the back, and then Marcus Webb on his feet, and then a sound that was different from polite applause, that had more weight to it, the specific quality of people clapping because they had decided to, and not because the social calculus required it. Not everyone stood. Douglas Fenn did not stand. Carmela stood after a moment's hesitation, which was its own thing. Tom Whitfield remained seated and applauded from there. None of that surprised her. She walked off the stage and Diane was in the corridor with water and the expression she wore when she was trying very hard not to be visibly emotional about something, which meant the corners of her eyes were doing something she was working to control. "Okay," Diane said. "Okay. How bad was it?" "It wasn't bad." She handed over the water. No, it wasn't bad." The rest of the conference day moved the way conference days moved. Sessions, breaks, sidebar conversations, the management of logistics. Evelyn moved through it in the particular mode she had developed over years of events: present, attentive, able to engage at full capacity on each individual conversation while tracking the room's larger temperature in her peripheral awareness. 3 investors sought her out specifically to say something positive. 2 others were noticeably cooler than usual, and she registered both without drama. An analyst from a partner firm told her it was the most honest thing he'd heard at an industry event in 5 years, which she took as a data point rather than a verdict. By 3 in the afternoon, when the breakout sessions were running and she had a 20-minute gap, she stepped outside the side entrance of the Carver Center. It was a service alley, unmarked door, concrete, a recycling bin. Not a triumphant location, but it was quiet and the air was cold and she needed 2 minutes that weren't anything. She took out her phone. She hadn't told Mason about the speech. She'd told him, on Wednesday, that she had an important conference presentation. She had not told him it was specifically about him or about the things she'd said at the board meeting or about the way his name had been in a financial journalist piece as a liability. Some instinct had kept her from telling him, not protectiveness exactly, more like wanting to know what she was actually doing before she narrated it to someone else. She called him now. He picked up on the second ring. In the background, she could hear the particular ambient sounds of the community center. Voices, movement, something metal on metal. "Hey," he said. "Hey, are you at the center?" Plumbing in the women's bathroom. One of the supply lines was weeping. A pause. "How'd the conference go?" She leaned against the wall. "I told about 400 people a story about you." Silence. Then, "About me. About the gala. About the community center. About what you said to Voss. About what it means. What it taught me about what leadership actually looks like." She waited. "I used your name." Another silence, longer. You didn't have to do that, he said. It wasn't angry. It was the particular quiet of someone absorbing something unexpected. I know. That's... He stopped. She heard him set something down. That's going to make things more complicated for you. Probably. She looked up at the alley wall. But I said it because it was the true thing, and you told me to say the true thing. A long beat. How'd it land? He said. Richard Holt stood up. Douglas Fenn didn't. I don't know who those people are. Richard is on my side. Douglas is the problem. She almost smiled. Most of the room landed somewhere between them, which is probably the realistic outcome. Okay, he processed this. Are you all right? The question had a texture to it. Not the professional "are you managing this," but the other kind. The kind that asked about the person underneath the situation. She had noticed in these months that he asked it differently than most people did. Like the answer actually mattered to the question. Yeah, she said. I am. She meant it. I'll tell you the rest later. I should go back in. Okay. Mason. She stopped, found the words. I meant what I said. In the speech. All of it. A moment. I know, he said quietly. That's the thing about you. She went back inside. The formal portion of the conference ended at 5. The networking reception ran until 7, and she moved through it the way she always did. Deliberately, not rushing, making the time mean something. By 6:15, the composition of the conversations had shifted in a way that told her something real was happening. 2 investors who had been among the cooler ones earlier were now seeking her out. A fund manager from the Midwest, someone she'd been trying to get traction with for 8 months, introduced himself and said he'd been interested in Viridian's approach for a while and that today had clarified something for him, which was vague enough to mean several things, but none of them bad. Douglas Fenn left at 5:45 without seeking her out, which was also information. She found Richard at the edge of the reception at 6:30, standing with a glass of sparkling water and observing the room in the way of someone who had attended a great many events and had long since made peace with their purpose. Well, he said. Well, she said, I'm going to be honest with you. He turned his water in his hand. I didn't know which way that was going to go when you started. Neither did I. The second half helped. The strategic section. You gave them something to hold on to. He paused. If you'd only given them the first half, you'd have walked out of a standing ovation and into a board crisis. The combination was what worked. I know. She had thought about the architecture of it for 4 days specifically because of that. Douglas is going to be quiet for a while, Richard said. Not gone. Quiet. He's recalculating. He looked at her. Voss isn't done, Evelyn. Whatever article he facilitated, that was one tool. He has others. I know that too. And your response to those will matter more than today. He set his glass on a passing tray. But today was the right thing to do. And I want to say that plainly, since I asked you to think carefully, and you did, and it came out right. You stood up, she said. He adjusted his jacket. I did. The understatement of a man who had done a deliberate thing and saw no need to elaborate on it. She got home at 8:15. She took off her shoes at the door, a habit she'd gotten from watching Mason at the community center. He always left his outside. It was something about tracking in whatever he'd been working with. She made herself a bowl of rice and leftover vegetables because the refrigerator had nothing more ambitious to offer, and she sat at the kitchen counter and ate it and did not turn on her laptop. Her phone had 39 messages. She read the subject lines without opening most of them. Several from investors, one from a media outlet requesting comment, one from Carter Blaine, which she set aside for Diane, one from Marcus Webb saying the live stream clip of the opening speech had already been shared 300 times on the financial community's social platforms, which was more than any previous conference moment by a factor of 4. She put the phone down. She thought about Mason at the gala, crossing a room toward a thing that needed doing. She thought about him at the homework table, asking Lily to explain each step back to him. She thought about what Gloria had said. He carries things he should probably put down. She thought about Lily holding the measuring tape with the focused expression of someone who'd been given a real job. She thought about what he'd said on the phone just before she went back into the conference. That's the thing about you. She wasn't entirely sure what he meant. She thought he probably meant that she meant things, that when she said something, it was because she'd decided it was true and not for any other reason. That this was, for him, not a small thing to find in a person. She was sitting with that when her phone lit up again. A text from Mason. Lily asks if the playground dedication can be on a weekend. She says she's very busy on weekdays. Evelyn looked at the text for a moment. Then she typed, "Tell her I'll check the schedule, but a weekend works for me." Then, after a moment's consideration, "Also tell her she's 8. She's not that busy." The response came 90 seconds later. "She says you don't know her life." Evelyn laughed. She put the phone down and finished her rice and sat in her kitchen in the quiet of a Thursday evening, thinking that she had said the true thing in a room of 400 people today, and it had not destroyed her, and that she had 2 more weeks to help finish a playground, and that Douglas Fenn was recalculating somewhere across the city, and that Harlan Voss was not done. But also, sitting right next to all of that, given equal weight by whatever had changed in her over the past months, the fact that an 8-year-old had a packed schedule and wasn't afraid to say so, and that her father had passed the phone to her to send that message, and that there was something between those two things that Evelyn was no longer pretending she wasn't aware of. The playground dedication was set for the second Saturday of May. Evelyn confirmed it with Patricia on Friday. When she texted Mason, he responded, "Works for us. Lily already told everyone in her class." Evelyn asked, what did she tell them? That her dad built a playground and her friend Evelyn helped and they should come. She read the message twice. Her friend Evelyn said, without calculation, without awareness, that it was anything but accurate. The pure, uncomplicated truth of a child who called things what they were. Outside the window, the city was winding into a Friday evening. Somewhere across it, Douglas Fenn was making calls. And somewhere in the North Side neighborhood, in a modest apartment above a dry cleaner's that she'd never been to, but could picture clearly, a man was making dinner for his daughter and had probably already stopped thinking about the speech and moved on to whatever needed doing next, because that was how he was built. She had known a lot of people in her career. She had known competent people, strategic people, people who were brilliant and people who were effective, and people who were both. She had not known many people whose first instinct, at cost to themselves, was to stand where they needed to stand. She had said that today, in front of 400 people. She had meant every word of it. And sitting in her kitchen with her phone in her hand and the city humming outside and 38 unread messages and at least one more round coming from Voss and a board that was still not fully settled, she understood, with the clarity that sometimes came after a hard day had gone the way it was supposed to, that some things took the time they took and some things you couldn't accelerate, and some things were worth holding on to exactly as they were, without pushing them anywhere, until they became what they were going to be. The playground was finished on a Friday. Mason sent her a photo at 6:40 in the evening. No message, just the image. The frame fully assembled, the platform boards in place, the slide installed at the angle Lily had supervised with considerable authority over 3 separate weekends. The swings hung level. The ground cover was spread and raked. In the background, the community center's south wall with its bright mural caught the last of the afternoon light. Evelyn looked at the photo for a long time. She had been in a meeting when it arrived. A call with 2 of Viridian's larger institutional clients, the kind of conversation that required her full attention, and got it. She had not checked her phone until the call ended. And then she'd sat in her office chair, jacket still on, and looked at what 7 months of Thursday evenings and Saturday mornings had produced, and felt something she couldn't immediately put a name to. Not pride exactly, something quieter. The specific satisfaction of a thing that exists now that did not exist before, and the knowledge of your own hands in it. She typed back, "It's perfect." 3 seconds later, "Not perfect. The slide bracket on the left side is 3 millimeters high." She smiled at her phone. "Does it affect the slide?" "No, then it's perfect." A longer pause. Then, "See you tomorrow." The dedication was at 10 in the morning. She arrived at 9:50 to find the courtyard already populated. Patricia had put out folding chairs in a rough semicircle facing the playground, and perhaps 30 people were there. Families from the breakfast program, a handful of volunteers, 2 women from the Thursday GED class, Robert from the shipping plant, who was 3 weeks into his new job at the logistics company and had the particular look of a man who was still adjusting to not being in crisis. Gloria was there in a good coat, which Evelyn had never seen her wear before, and the sight of it made something tighten briefly in her chest. Lily was at the entrance to the playground in a yellow jacket, self-appointed as the person who would decide when the ribbon, an actual ribbon, red, that Patricia had produced from somewhere, was cut. She had strong opinions about the timing. "Not until everyone is seated," she told Evelyn when Evelyn came through the gate. "Okay. And not until Dad finishes talking to Mr. Robert, because they've been talking for a really long time." "I'll let your dad know." "I already told him." Lily looked at the assembled crowd with the assessment of someone running a logistical operation. Also, Gloria brought muffins, but she said we can't have them until after. "That seems right." "I don't think it's right, but she's in charge of the muffins." Mason appeared at her elbow. He was in clean clothes, not dress clothes, but clothes that had been chosen rather than grabbed, which for him amounted to the same thing. He looked at Lily, then at Evelyn, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did. "She's been out here since 8:30, he said quietly. "I heard that," Lily said, without turning around. He looked at Evelyn. "You ready?" "I'm not the one speaking. Patricia asked if you'd say something." "Patricia asked me 2 days ago, and I said yes, and then I didn't prepare anything." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "You gave a speech to 400 investors last week." "That was different. I had 4 days and a legitimate crisis as motivation." She looked at the assembled families, at Robert laughing at something, at Gloria arranging the muffin table with the authority of someone who took muffin arrangement seriously. This is people who actually matter." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Patricia called everyone to order at 10 past. She was brief and warm, talked about the 18 months the project had been in planning, the community need, the volunteers who had made it possible. She mentioned Mason by name, and the applause was genuine and specific, the kind that came from people who had watched the work happen and understood what it had cost in hours and effort and showing up. Mason nodded once, the same way he'd nodded at the gala after the thing with Voss, acknowledging it without making it into something larger than it was. When Patricia turned to Evelyn, she stood and said the thing that came to her, which was not the thing she would have said if she'd prepared, and which was probably better for that. She said, "I came here the first time because I was curious about a person. I kept coming because I couldn't find a good reason not to. And somewhere in between, this place stopped being somewhere I visited and became somewhere I belonged." She looked at the playground. "I've been in rooms where people debate what success looks like. I've sat through a lot of those conversations. I don't think I've ever learned as much in any of them as I've learned standing in this courtyard watching someone do work they weren't asked to do because they thought it needed doing." She stopped there. "That's all I've got. Let's cut the ribbon." Lily cut the ribbon. The children went first. There were 6 of them from the assembled families, ranging from about 4 to 10, and they went for the slide with the focused urgency of children who had been watching it take shape for months and had been waiting for this with considerable impatience. Lily went down second, after a 4-year-old in red boots went first and declared it acceptable. Then Lily, then the others, and the sounds the playground made in its first 10 minutes of use. The particular creak of new equipment under new weight, the sound of children, were the best argument anyone could have made for any of it. Mason stood next to Evelyn at the edge of the courtyard, and they watched, not talking for a while, just watching. "You didn't write anything down," he said eventually. "No." "What you said was good." "I meant it." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "That's still what I notice, that you mean the things you say." He said it the way he said most true things, without performance, like he was just reporting an observation. She looked at him. "Is that unusual?" "In my experience?" He watched Lily come down the slide again. "Yeah, it is." It became a party, eventually, with Gloria's muffins and coffee from the center's kitchen and someone producing a portable speaker that played music at a reasonable volume. Ran until noon. By the time it wound down, Evelyn had held 2 conversations she hadn't expected. The first was with a woman named Dara, who had 3 children and was managing alone after her husband left 8 months ago, who had heard about the conference speech somehow. It had circulated in places Evelyn hadn't anticipated, and who said quietly, while her youngest pulled at her sleeve. It meant something, what you said, about not pretending the inconvenient thing didn't happen. Evelyn didn't have the clean response to that. She said, "I'm glad," and meant it, and that seemed to be enough. The second conversation was with Robert, who had tracked her down specifically. "I want to say something," he said, with the manner of a man who had prepared this and was going to get through it. "Mason told me about the job contact in September. I called the next day. But what he actually did, what made it possible for me to make that call, was something he said the first time we talked." He stopped. "He told me my kids looked like they were doing fine. I don't know if he knows how much that mattered, but I wanted to tell someone." She drove home at 12:30 with the windows down, despite the May temperature being only marginally warm enough for it, because she wanted the air. She thought about Dara. She thought about Robert. She thought about the 4-year-old in red boots. She had been turning an idea over for 3 weeks. Since the conference, through the board's uneasy quiet, through 2 more investor calls and 1 carefully worded email from Douglas Fenn that she had read and set aside and not answered yet. She had been turning it over the way she turned things over, slowly, thoroughly, testing the structure of it, looking for the flaws before committing. She called her attorney on Monday morning. "I want to establish a foundation," she said. "Independent from Viridian but not unaffiliated. Focus on single-parent families and children in underserved communities. Direct service funding. Not administrative overhead. Not programs that spend 70% on themselves. I want to know what that looks like structurally, what the governance requirements are, and what realistic capitalization gets it operational in the first year." Her attorney, a woman named Sandra, who had known Evelyn for 7 years and had stopped being surprised by her approximately 5 years ago, asked 3 clarifying questions and said she'd have a preliminary framework by Thursday. She told Mason about it on Wednesday. They were at the diner, their diner now, the one with the bad coffee and the good grilled cheese, though Lily was at Mason's sister's place that evening, so it was just the 2 of them in the booth, and it was the first time they'd been somewhere without Lily as the third presence at the table. It felt different, not uncomfortable, just different in the way of 2 people who had learned each other primarily in one context and were now in a slightly different one. She laid out the idea while he listened the way he listened, fully, without interrupting, with the quality of attention that she had first noticed at the gala, and that still struck her as uncommon. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "It's a good idea," he said. "I think so. The direct funding part is what makes it work. Most of those organizations, I know, 60 cents on the dollar if you're lucky." She turned her coffee cup. "I want you to run the community outreach side." Silence. "I mean it," she said. "Not as a favor, not as something symbolic. The outreach work, identifying families, building the program relationships, making sure the money is actually getting where it's supposed to go. That's not something I can do well. It's not my skill set. You've been doing it for 2 years without anyone paying you for it." She looked at him. "I want to pay you for it, properly." He looked at the table for a moment. She had learned to read his silences. Not all of them, but enough. This one was the kind where he was taking something seriously and making sure he wasn't reacting to the surface of it. "Why me?" he said. It wasn't false modesty. It was a real question. He wanted to know her actual reasoning. "Because you know what families need underneath the thing they're asking for," she said. "You said that to me once. I've thought about it 100 times since." She paused. "And because you won't let it become something other than what it's supposed to be. I've watched you. You're allergic to drift. The moment something stops being useful to the actual people, you'll say so." She met his eyes. "I need someone like that more than I need someone who knows how to run a nonprofit." He was quiet again. Outside the diner window, the street was doing its evening thing. A couple walking a dog, a delivery cyclist, the ordinary machinery of a neighborhood. "I'd need to know the money is clean," he said finally. "All of it. No donor conditions that redirect the mission. No board that has a separate agenda." "I expected that, yes. And I'd need to keep volunteering at Northside. The foundation work doesn't replace that. I wouldn't ask it to." He looked at her. "Okay," he said. "Just that. Okay." The same way he'd agreed to most things. Without ceremony, because the decision was made and decoration was beside the point. She exhaled. "Okay." The waiter came by and refilled their coffee without being asked, which at the diner meant you were regulars, and they both registered it without commenting, and she thought, this is the kind of thing that accumulates. The refilled coffee, the ribbon in Lily's hands, the text at 6:40 on a Friday evening, the accumulation of ordinary things that become the texture of a life. The foundation was incorporated in July. Sandra had been thorough, as she always was, and the governance structure was clean and auditable, and Mason had read every page of it before he signed anything, which had taken 3 days and which Evelyn had expected. The board was small, 5 people, all of them chosen for specific knowledge rather than social cachet. Patricia was one of them. A child welfare attorney named James, who Evelyn had met through the legal aid program at Northside, was another. Richard Holt, to her surprise, had asked to be considered. She had thought about it for 2 days and said yes, because his presence was not decorative, and he understood that. They called it the Reed Cross Foundation, which Mason had objected to on the grounds that alphabetically Cross should come first. It doesn't go alphabetically, Evelyn said. It goes in order of who was already doing the work when I showed up. He had no effective counterargument for that. Harlan Voss made one more move in June. He had found a journalist willing to frame the foundation announcement as a vanity project, a CEO using philanthropy to rehabilitate her image after a governance controversy. The piece ran in a minor outlet and generated moderate attention for about 2 days. Douglas Fenn sent her a careful email suggesting she might want to consider a response strategy. She wrote back a single sentence. The Foundation's first quarterly report will be public in October. The numbers will respond. They did. The first quarter's report showed 91 cents of every donated dollar reaching direct services. It was not a glamorous number. It was an accurate one. And accuracy had a durability that perception management didn't. Douglas Fenn did not raise a board concern in the second half of the year. On a Thursday evening in September, Evelyn was at the diner again. Lily across from her working on a book report, Mason across from Evelyn reading through a site assessment for a family in the Foundation's first intake cohort, when Lily looked up without warning and said, "Are you going to live with us?" Mason looked up from his papers. Evelyn said, "What?" "Emma at school," Lily said, with the patient tone of someone explaining context to people who were not keeping up. "Her mom's boyfriend moved in, and now he lives there. Are you going to do that?" The diner continued around them. Someone at the counter ordered pie. The coffee machine made its noise. Mason's expression was, for once, something she couldn't fully read, somewhere between mortified and something else, something quieter. "That's," he started. "I'm just asking," Lily said, "because you're here a lot. And you came to the playground, and you know where we live, and you know all my teachers' names now." She looked at Evelyn with the direct, undefended gaze of a child who had learned to take stock of things carefully before trusting them. "I don't mind if you do. I'm just asking." The silence lasted long enough to be real. Evelyn looked at Lily. She looked at the book report, half finished, the pencil marks in the margin where Lily had underlined things she wanted to use. She looked at Mason, who was looking at her, and whose expression she could read now. He was waiting, not for her to say the right thing, but for her to say the true thing. It was the look of someone who had learned that the true thing was the only thing worth waiting for. "Not yet," Evelyn said, "but I'm not going anywhere." Lily considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Okay," she said, and went back to her book report. Mason looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. There was no version of what was between them that required words at that particular moment, because some things announced themselves adequately through the simple fact of 2 people sitting across from each other in a diner booth, in the particular ease of people who had arrived at something real and knew it, without needing to make it into a speech. He reached across the table and took her hand briefly, not dramatically. Just for a moment, the way you touch something you were glad was there. Then he went back to his site assessment. Then she went back to her notes. And Lily, across from them, kept working on her book report in the comfortable silence of a child who had asked the things she needed to ask and gotten the answer she was looking for, and did not require anything further from anyone at the table. What Evelyn understood, in the months that followed, through the Foundation's first cohort of families, through Viridian's Q3 report, through a board that had found its equilibrium, through Saturdays at Northside where the playground was used daily now, And the equipment had gotten its first scuffs and scratches, which Patricia called damage and Mason called evidence, was that she had been wrong about what she was building. She had thought, in the years before the gala, that she was building a firm, a career, a record of performance that would compound over time into something durable. She had not been wrong about that, but she had been wrong about what made it matter. What made it matter was what you did with the edges of it, the spaces around the thing you were building, what you chose when no one was keeping score, when the calculation said stay still, when the easier version of yourself was right there and available and wouldn't have cost much. She had met a man who lived entirely in those edges, who had walked away from the version of himself that had carried a rank and a title and the particular authority of someone who operated in high-stakes environments and had come back to something quieter and harder, the daily, unremarkable work of being present for his daughter, for a community center, for strangers whose leases he'd help interpret and whose children he'd watch on the playground he'd built because it needed building. It was not a dramatic life. It was not a story anyone would have pointed to as exemplary before a particular October night when he had crossed a ballroom floor toward a thing that needed doing and changed, without meaning to, the course of someone else's understanding. She thought about that sometimes. The randomness of it. The way things that mattered most often arrived without announcement, through a service corridor, in a maintenance uniform, carrying a water bottle instead of a drink. She thought about the kind of courage that didn't look like courage from the outside, the kind that wasn't performed for any audience, that didn't require a crisis to activate, that showed up on ordinary Thursdays and rainy Saturdays and in the middle of conversations about fractions. She thought about Lily, who had watched all of this and processed it with the particular clarity of a child who had learned early that the world did not always keep its promises, and who had looked across a diner booth and asked the question she needed to ask because she had decided in her careful 8-year-old way that the answer was likely to be okay. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the largest thing. None of it was perfect. Mason still got too closed off sometimes, went quiet for days in a way that she had learned not to try to talk him out of because he came back on his own and trying to accelerate it made it worse. She was still capable of defaulting to the professional perimeter when something scared her, of managing a situation instead of being in it, of reaching for the version of herself that protected the edges instead of the version that showed up. They argued twice in the fall, once about something real, and once about something that was nominally about logistics and was actually about something else, and neither argument was resolved cleanly or quickly. Real things rarely were, but they were building something, not perfectly, not according to any plan either of them had made. Incrementally, the way you built anything that was meant to last, board by board, post by post, checking the level as you went, making adjustments when the ground wasn't what you thought it was. On a Saturday in October, Evelyn was in the North Side courtyard when a woman named Priya, new to the breakfast program, newly single, 2 children in the homework room, looked at the playground and said, "Who built that?" Gloria, who was nearby, pointed at Mason without looking up from what she was doing. "Him and her," a gesture toward Evelyn, "and a few others. Took them most of the year." Priya looked at the playground. The morning light was on it. Children were using the swings with the particular pleasure of children who had good swings available and had not yet taken them for granted. "It's beautiful," Priya said. Evelyn thought about the bracket that was 3 millimeters high. She thought about the Saturday in February when the concrete had cured slower than expected and they'd lost a week. She thought about Lily's measuring tape and the cold April evenings and the specific ache of her arms after the platform boards went in. "It was a lot of work," she said. "The best things usually are," Priya said. And Evelyn thought, yes, that is the thing exactly. Not the destination, not the finished product standing in the morning light with children on it, and the muffins going and the coffee bad but hot, and the people here because they needed to be and found a place that let them. The work itself, the showing up, the decision, made repeatedly and without fanfare, to do the thing that needed doing because you were there and it was in front of you and you had the hands for it. That was the whole lesson. Everything else was commentary.